Well, I have, before beginning, just a short word about two dear friends, John Dunaway and Monsieur le Baron d'Argent, we call the Silver Baron. Thanks to Vladimir and Denise, we had the wonderful privilege of meeting Maurice in France. And I have a blasphemous but cute saying that applies, and it is this: as luck would have it, Providence was on our side. It's bad theology because luck is under the aegis of the Almighty, not the reverse. The replacement for Judas in Acts, we always said, was done by rolling the dice. At any rate, I used to think a good deal about destiny, and the word in French is similar: destin, destiné, fate, luck, doom, even nemesis, a kind of a Greek tragedy, but Providence was on our side thanks to the Volkoffs and to the chance of meeting friends. We had a wonderful meal together at a restaurant, Charbonnel, in Brantôme in southwest France, Périgord. And Maurice was telling us stories, and I noticed everybody in the restaurant was listening and laughing. It was amazing. And then a story about when he lived at the Place de Vosges, he had a horse. And we had a retelling of the story the other day, and it was a bet with a friend. The friend said, "You can't keep a horse at the Place de Vosges." Well, he did. And somehow the first time after setting up a stable, he tried to control the horse, but going down toward the Place de Bastille, the policeman tried to stop him. He couldn't stop. Well, Maurice was himself, the friend, the policeman, and the horse. I wish you could have heard that. Secondly, I have in my pocket something that you can't see very well, but it's a cork and the top of a champagne bottle. At the time we visited the Volkoffs, he lived in what I called a castle. He did not. And we have a wonderful little picture that he did of that place, but he invited us to eat. And before we ate, here were 2 bottles of champagne. He moved one, then all of a sudden he has a saber in his hands. Well, the champagne spewed up, and I said, uh-oh, we're gonna eat slivers of glass. And he poured without, I don't think, dropping any of the champagne on it. It was something that I just didn't believe. There was no prior notice this was going to happen. But anyway, as a souvenir, you know, we have the actual cork in the top of the bottle. I found out this week you could pull up on the internet a video that shows how to do this. It has to be very cold. It has to be a 25-degree. And it's the back of the sword, not the sharp part. At any rate, this goes back to Napoleon, who celebrated his victories. And Vladimir said in one of Tolstoy's stories, you know, he describes this old military stunt. But John Marsden Dunaway and I, as he's already said, grew up in this same county. But John became important for us at Mercer, straight from Duke. Ruth commented this morning, you know, how young Trish and John looked at the time. And their firstborn, Michael, was like Vladimir. He was writing poetry, I think, at age 5, 6, and 7. And it was pretty good poetry. Julian Green, I may never have heard about until John began to talk. And there was a connection with Denise, who had found a book of Julian Green's and saw him on the corner and said, "I have a book of yours," which surprised, and she returned it. But he had loaned this to Jacques Maritain, and John at Duke had read the diaries and knew about this. The woman was not named, but this was Denise before he ever met Denise. At Mercer, John has continued the Faculty Christian Fellowship and talked about the beloved community. There's nothing superficial about this. This is straight from the heart. Behind every good man, it is said a lady is behind. Well, for this marriage, I would say often Trish is out in front and common sense and doing the legwork on so many things. She has many talents in art and can tell you about Geechee and Gullah dialects around Charleston, which we have heard. Well, as luck would have it, Providence was on our side. Without John, I told John in the beginning, if nobody else came but Maurice, we would have a great success. I'll say that again. Now about Vladimir, before I talk about Vladimir the Generous, it seems others have talked about where one met him first, and I'll say just a word about the death. We tried to get Denise to our home about 5 times on the weekends in 1968. Oh, I'm so sorry, I'll be out of town. Well, later we found out Vladimir was in Atlanta, and she would be with Vladimir in Atlanta. We even saw where they lived on West Peach Street. On the weekends. But at any rate, we finally invited Vladimir, and he came, and we began to have conversation. And I guess I was telling him some of the horror stories about the South, and all of a sudden, we were still eating. He hopped up and said, "Brewster, you're no liberal. Liberals don't have a sense of wit." And from that time on, we have been great friends. About his death, Ruth and I were on a tour, and we're in Prague, Czech Republic, when a dear friend called us on the telephone at 6 o'clock in the morning and told us about Vladimir's sudden death, September the 14th, 2005. Seems just impossible that it's been 8 years. We would have gone to France had we been in Macon, but Denise was, of course, in a state of shock, and I wrote a letter to Denise in December, 2 or 3 months later, and began by saying, several times when I was trying to thank Vladimir for his generosity to us, he always responded in a way that shocked and surprised me. "But I am not generous." It sounded like he wanted to argue, and he said it emphatically, "I am not generous." So I listed about 18, 19, 20 things in this letter to Denise, and that's what I have to say today. It's intensely personal, and some of it probably won't make a lot of sense. As a matter of fact, I have 3 speeches. It's actually 3 versions of the same speech, and it goes beyond just listing the generous things that Vladimir did for us. One of the top moments of his generosity, we stopped by Heinz Terrace one day, and he had worked all day long setting up a little stage like paper dolls with chairs, hangings on the wall, and he acted out what he had already written in French, but translated in English, "Love Kills," which you can see still during this time of the Volkoff Colloquium. At any rate, imagine that. Somebody would spend all day long and he was not only a writer, but he was a director, and I mean, he had attention to details, and a sunny disposition always, and so we saw this the first time. Later, we took a television set up to Decatur, and his mother watched this. That would not have been possible except John talked Vladimir into allowing a video to be made, one only, and it's still available, I think, in the library. Secondly, we traveled with the Volkoffs more than once, but a week in Barcelona, Spain. This was an important place to go because when Vladimir kidnapped his 5-year-old daughter, Tatiana, he took his mother and Tatiana and tried to be incognito in wherever he went. But we were trying to find just where he lived in the Barrio Gothic. It was a narrow street, cobblestones, and Ruth and Denise were walking behind Vladimir, and Vladimir was slightly ahead of me. All of a sudden, screams, and in French, Denise was shouting, "Thief, thief." And about that time, here came a young boy walking very fast by me, and he started to run. Well, I tackled the guy. I played football, and I got him. But I hit the cobblestone and was knocked out for about 3 seconds. And Denise says, "Ruth, you have a man." I was a hero to Vladimir. And Vladimir, I said, "Vladimir, that's the stupidest thing I ever did. He could have knifed me, he could have shot me. If I just thought 3 seconds." No. The soldier acts and then thinks. And so I had about 3 helpings of scotch that day. At any rate, when we met the Volkoffs, Vladimir surprised me and said, "Okay, Brewster, this time you pay all the bills one day and I'll pay all the bills the next day." Well, I would have done anything. I would have paid all the bills for all of us. But it turned out Vladimir paid more during that week than I did. We would go to the bullfights. He had warned me, said, "Do not go to a bullfight until you're with me, and I'll explain what's going on." Well, I didn't know there was so much. I had not read Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises at that time. At any rate, we had the best seats. We sat by what would be called the mayor. He paid a lot of money. And secondly, it was his day to go to a dinner meeting with flamenco dancers. There were several. At any rate, we were invited to stay till the second performance. And here came the owner, a woman who looked to me to be about 60 years old now, but she was trying to dress up and look like she was 18 years old. They had pictures of her when she was 18, a very nice looking lady. But she comes almost to our table and kicks up her bare leg in front of Vladimir. All this is in Spanish, and said, "Sir, what do you think of that?" Immediately, Vladimir says, "Nothing over which to commit suicide." The whole house, really laughed. He said he couldn't handle Spanish, but to answer that quickly, said a great deal. Another part of his generosity was introducing us to so many of his friends and associates that I never would have met. The Hussar, Jamie Cockfield knew this man who was actually a Hussar, Mr. Reichart in Atlanta. He had lost his right arm, fighting the Reds. He was a white Russian, and he invited me to lunch and told me about the horses they had in their regiment. They were beige looking until they came near the ankle and had to have white feet. And they went all over, I think, the world to everyone had the same. But he thought about committing suicide after he lost his arm. Prince Andronikov. Some of you know him, and he came to Macon one time to see Vladimir. And Mrs. Turpin on Hines Terrace had a cocktail party. And when I saw this man, I said, this is somebody important. I mean, his presence, was overwhelming. And Vladimir comes and whispers, this man, when he was the translator for de Gaulle in Moscow, brought in the diplomatic pouch the first circle of Solzhenitsyn. And it turns out this man also was a theologian at St. Sergius, where we were able to visit at one time. I never would have met anybody like that. Gerald McCain was in the lycée with Vladimir. There's a picture of the whole class, and Vladimir looks like he's half the age of everybody else in there. And I asked Gerald one time, what was Vladimir like at the Sorbonne? Said, well, nobody knew him. Said he would ride on a bicycle and come, but every time the papers were handed back, he had number one. And I said, I'd better get to know this guy. So Vladimir was already, I think he was number one all the way through schools, wherever he was. Andrei, I should know his last name, worked for Dmitrievich in Switzerland, a Serb publisher who became a great friend of Vladimir's. Andrei said he was looking over the next novel they perhaps might publish. And here was something that just stood out. I mean, it was Vladimir's. Vladimir had had many rejections, but now this, he said, he took it immediately to the publisher, and he saw likewise. This was great stuff. But Lodge Dome was a small publishing house, and they said, we must go to Paris and find a larger publishing house. And so Bernard Forlois comes into the picture, and they began to publish. I remember Vladimir coming back to Macon after saying he had a ticket to go over and talk to these people. And he says, if you can believe what they say, I may become famous. Well, he became famous. There's a nice lady in Atlanta, I don't know her name, but it may be the wealthiest home that I've ever visited. Vladimir one day said, let's go by and see so-and-so. Said, she has entertained de Gaulle in France and so forth. Well, we came into the garage and Cadillacs were parked all around. We come in and there were two fancy-looking dogs that, ran to her and jumped on the couch and so forth. Now, I think she was the grandmother of a girl who was at Agnes Scott named Eglay. But Dr. Rousseau in Brussels, David Veal, and we were privileged to go to the premiere of the play Yalta, written by Vladimir. And we met a Dr. Rousseau, very nice, polite, and we read later that he was one who encouraged Vladimir to write Yalta using the actual documents and words of the big three. I've already mentioned Maurice as one we would not have known except for Vladimir. I'll mention one other. Going to Hong Kong tailors, I didn't know there was such, up on Highway 400. We walk in, and here's this very dignified Indian who greets him by name and pulls out the folder. This has happened before. Vladimir bought 7 suits, was measured again, and he said the way this happens, they send all of the updating to Hong Kong, and then they make the suits and send them to Paris, and a tailor there checks it out and makes a few corrections. Well, I shouldn't tell this, but one who has never spent more than, about $50 for a suit, 7 suits, the cheapest of which was $750. Moving on to another reason that I'm grateful to Vladimir. We talked a lot about Dostoevsky, the Grand Inquisitor chapter. And I thought I had squeezed all the blood out of that turnip and found out I didn't know anything. With Vladimir, we go into what's in the mind of the writer, Dostoevsky, what's in the mind of Ivan, what's in the mind of Alyosha looking at all of this, what's in the mind of the Bible. Well, over and over again in several of the big novels, Dostoevsky plays a major part, in The Pope's Guest especially. And one time, sitting on the front porch at Hines Terrace, I was talking about Southern Baptist of all things, and I said, you know, we grew up to open the Bible and put our finger right on one verse. Dostoevsky did that. And I found in The Pope's Guest, you have mention of this as well. But the Grand Inquisitor chapter, and also the temptation of Christ, and the setup, here is Vladimir. There's even a picture of Vladimir with all of the gargoyles. We had fun with that, you know, Vladimir is a gargoyle. But the conversation with regard to the temptation of Christ, Dostoevsky, all blended together in a way that let me see something about Russian Orthodoxy, the redemption of all of the world that I hadn't fully understood. I still haven't. Moving on, the last time we saw Vladimir, Ruth and I were in Paris, and he invited us to a small restaurant, Le Petit Lutetia. He says, now get the Petit. We don't want to go to the Lutetia. But this was not too far from the Invalides, and I think we were the only ones who were not Parisians. I think mostly males, white tablecloths, impeccable service, and I couldn't even pay for the wine. You know, we were the guest, and we ordered the most expensive there, which was, I think it was Peking duck. It was duck, canard. At any rate, that's the last time. If we ever go back to Paris, which is not likely, we will try that restaurant again. Another reason for generosity, the Russian Orthodox faith, introducing us to Father Townsend at a little church in Gwinnett County, which was actually a Swiss chalet that had been brought over here. And to walk in, you know, I was in another world. I was out of the world I knew. And all of these eyes, you know, Flannery O'Connor talks about ice-pick eyes, and in Parker's back, a Byzantine Christ tattooed on the back of the main character. Well, Vladimir was, I don't know whether he ever joined, but when he would go to Atlanta, he would visit. Father Townsend was an American, but at a funeral, I mean, he could well pass for a Russian. But I began to find out something about the Russian Orthodox faith, which seems very strange to one who grew up Southern Baptist in Northwest Georgia. And Vladimir kept trying to play a game that there were all sorts of themes of the Russian Orthodox in me, which I never could understand. And sometimes I would play to his biases and act like, you know, I was in his side politically. And I never would argue with him directly. Like Kierkegaard, I'd like to wound from behind, you know, and catch him on a contradiction. But Ruth would argue, and we prepared a little 50-page multiple choice test, which was outrageous to see who's the most conservative right-winger. And it turns out Vladimir and I were in the middle. Denise was the real right-winger, and Ruth was the liberal. At any rate, the meanings of the Orthodox faith, we were going to Greece, and he gave me 2 or 3 things to watch out for. One, we would see many pictures of Christ at the moment of coming from the descent into hell, and there would be chains. It says it's not very good art, but you know, the emphasis is on the resurrection. And he told us about Athens around Easter. The big mountain, I never can remember the name of it, Lycovitas or something, had a church on top. And secular Athens on that particular night became one big Byzantine church. And at a certain point, these people would come out of the Mass with candles, and everybody would light up, and the whole town would light. It would be, the Russian Orthodox light and darkness. The stress is on resurrection. So Christmas took a second place, is over against resurrection. And Vladimir explained that in Protestantism, he said, usually with a little contempt, spend so much time on sin and law and judgment. But in the Russian Orthodox faith, it's the resurrection, light and darkness. And this was a profound influence on all that he had to say in an original way about evil, which John has written about, the fecundity of evil. I'll say a little more about that later. Wonderful stories and anecdotes. Vladimir drawing from many, many sources. Western culture, Russian, French, even English. He taught Shakespeare and Amiel. At any rate, as one example, they were sophisticated. He asked me if I knew the difference between a diplomat and a lady. I said, no, but I always wanted to know. He said, well, if a diplomat says yes, he means maybe. If a diplomat says maybe, he means no. A diplomat never says no. A lady, if she says no, she means maybe. If a lady says maybe, she means yes. A lady never says yes. Another one from Vladimir has to do with the great philosopher René Descartes, who's famous, in several languages about, I think, therefore I am. I tried to say French to John, je pense, donc je suis. At any rate, it was in Latin. And it seems that René was in a bistro one night late, and the bartender says, Monsieur René, will you have another beer? And Descartes looked out the window meditatively and finally said, I think not. And he disappeared. Vladimir liked also the corn-pone jokes when I told him that Jack Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy, had a certain viewpoint of Lyndon Johnson, LBJ, and behind his back, they called LBJ Uncle Cornpone, and they called Lady Bird Little Pork Chop. Vladimir just loved that particular story. Flannery O'Connor. I don't think Vladimir ever heard of Flannery O'Connor until I began to talk. I think immediately he read every story, and he chided me because I had not emphasized the lame shall enter first. It's a very grim story. But anyway, he began to teach me about Flannery O'Connor. I thought I knew a good bit. But Flannery appealed to him, and especially a saying that I saw was picked up and used for a celebration recently. Flannery, like James Joyce, wouldn't leave anything alone, and she had this saying, the truth, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you odd. Well, that applies to Flannery, to Vladimir, to James Joyce, and to others. As a matter of fact, at the last meeting with Vladimir, we talked about Flannery in connection to something that happened in the White House. I was just surfing the television one night, and here were three speakers about to speak on Truman Capote, Eudora Welty, and Flannery O'Connor. And it was a very nice room. I didn't know where it was. And when they finished, who should come? The hostess was Laura Bush. This was the White House. And she thanked everybody for the speaking and said, before you leave, I wish to read you a poem from Flannery O'Connor. Well, this particular poem, the only place I know that it's published is in Georgia on My Mind, a little effort that Vladimir and I did together. I had copied in pencil the unedited from a paper of Flannery when she was in the 10th grade in Milledgeville. And the more I think about this, the whimsical poetry gives the themes of Vladimir. If you think of Olduvai, Cain and Abel, and how culture is related to evil, we're all descendants of Cain. You know, the other, if you take literally, Vladimir knew it was not literal, but we're all descendants of Cain. And this is the basis for culture and creativity. John's written an article in the dossier H called The Fecundity of Evil. It's really an original thought, and it has some similarities to St. Augustine, I think. But anyway, here's the first book by Flannery O'Connor, unedited. When man was just a caveman in the prehistoric age, his mind began to wander and his being began to rage. To think that he had all these years been lonesome, dumb, and tough without a spot of culture to make him not so rough. He took his brain within his hands and pressed it hard and tight until within his feeble mind there shone a spark of light. Thus, inspiration came to man, and he without delay wrote down the words she told him. She told him on slides of stone and clay. And when the masterpiece was done, he called his friends to look. They asked him what he named the thing. He said with ease, a book. Thus the ancestor of books was born, on slides of stone and clay. How far removed was that old book from those we have today? And since we have the chance to read, let's take it while we can. How far removed are we today from prehistoric man? We thought we would never see where Vladimir lived in Decatur, but I was taking him to the Atlanta airport, and he says, well, if you're going to take me, you'll have to have lunch at my house. Well, I knew his mother lived there, and so here we were eating piroshki in his house with icons in the corners, very unique and lovely little house with a huge pine tree in front. At any rate, about that pine tree, about 10 times when Vladimir would come back from Decatur, he would bring pine straw, the cleanest pine straw. I think Mrs. Volkoff stroked each needle, but Ruth used those when we lived out in the country. When we were there, Vladimir said, come with me, and we went into a room, and there was a kind of a sideboard desk. And he says, here's where I wrote the moods of the sea, mostly standing up. So I saw the room. I later found out in some of his writings, I took him to Atlanta one time to mail something by email, and he says, I've just finished the first draft. Now I can begin writing the book. Well, he would put on tape what he had written and listen to it. I mean, this was a very careful workman, but we were honored to meet the family, including one time Tatiana, the daughter, and her 5-year-old Emmanuel, who later goes on to West Point, and now Maurice says has sort of disappeared out of the sight of Denise. Vladimir wrote a commentary on the Gospel of Matthew, in fact, of each of the Gospels. And the one that I would like to read and haven't yet, but I've ordered it, is the commentary on John. For Russian Orthodox, the Greeks really land on that particular one. Vladimir was something of a Marcionite. The Gnostics were heavy. He said, I know nothing about the Ancient Testament. And then I found out what Cain and Abel and Olduvai, all of this meant to him, and his theory about how culture somehow owes a lot to the source from evil. At any rate, it's not just Matthew, but particular exegesis on the Lord's Prayer, the Beatitudes, the theology of Paul. And then he comes across what I thought was a strange interpretation of something Jesus said in the first person. I said, how do you know Jesus meant that? Irony, of course, irony. Well, I think some of the New Testament scholars I studied under would find that surprising. He came to the centurion. I had forgotten how many times a centurion is mentioned in the Gospel of Matthew, and long paragraphs, But he took note of soldiers, also of king prince, and somehow I got the idea that New Testament was like being in America, democratically oriented. Well, he taught me a lesson on that. He says, don't you ever see king and prince in the New Testament? Reminding me of the importance of play. Vladimir was playful. He would work hard like Mozart, but intermittently he would stop. And I noticed one time in his office, he had a dart board hanging up. And he had a little sheet with 15 dart players. He was the only dart thrower. But here you would have a tournament. And such names as Cyrano, and Hamlet, and Ivan, and Peter the Great, and Grushenka. But he kept score very, very neatly. One day a cockroach came running across the floor. He says, don't step on it, don't step on it. And he pulled out of a drawer a BB pistol in the form of a Luger. And it took him 5 times, but he shot finally. I said, Vladimir, this is like ball bearings, you'll fall down. No, I have to keep sharp, I gave him a BB gun like this for Christmas. I think that was the happiest gift I ever gave him. And I found every day, he had target practice. Going hunting, we had some wilderness land over in Talbot County, and he loved to hunt. And I remember I never would have hunted deer except for Vladimir. I never would have killed a deer except for Vladimir. But the first time we hunted, I had a mount on my 30-06, and he said, that's not fair, that's cheating, says the deer. Well, he, on his deer stand, wounded a deer and was so happy he got down too fast, so the deer got up, dripping blood, and ran away. The next time we went hunting, Vladimir had a mount on his. Well, dogs, hunting, skeet, fencing. He tried to get fencing going in Macon and had some success. Now, in one time, there were many books that Vladimir gave us and inscribed with a sassy kind of remark. But I told him that I had read in Julian Green about a guidebook that dated from World War I time. I said, you probably can't get it. Well, lo and behold, in about 2 weeks, here came the book in French. And Julian Green had used this, and later Ruth and I, found things that we never would have found except for that guidebook. I think Lidwin Helly was the one who found the book in an antiquariat. At any rate, I never would have known about Julian Green except for John and the Volkoffs. Denise, once we were in Savannah, took us to the house where he lived. it had become a part of the Episcopal Church. But we found out later it was also the house where Sherman stayed when he captured Savannah and sent it as a Christmas present to Abraham Lincoln. So I was learning things about my own state that I never knew. Letting us stay in the Volkoff flat at Auteuil. Others were invited to do that too. Wonderful spot. You went in a little door, storefront, through a courtyard, and then on the other side was a school. So you had quietness, you had wonderful cappuccino and breads, and across the street supposedly was a restaurant where Moliere ate. At any rate, Ruth and I stayed there more than once, thanks to the generosity of Vladimir and Denise. I always carried a shortwave radio when we went overseas, and so we came in one time about midnight. I said, Ruth, let's see what's on the BBC. So help me, this is a true story. Turned it on. We continue tonight the reading of Vladimir Volkov's book, The Turnaround. So we listened to chapter 7 in their flat. Unbelievable. Physically, personally, I apologize for even mentioning this. I had a botched up hernia operation and had to go see the doctor for a checkup. And we lived about 8 miles out. Vladimir came, he knew we were going, and I think I was about to faint. Now, he was shorter than I, but physically he held me up. I mean, he did practical things, even though in many matters, in the attempt, he was impractical. We were left one time at Hines Terrace, and Ruth and Denise went somewhere, and all he had to do was to fix the soup. And I heard the soup, beginning to boil. Vladimir's use of firearms had deafened him a little bit. I said, I think you better check on that. No, I'm watching my clock. I said, well, I think I hear it about to boil over. Well, he went back. It had boiled over. Well, somehow he jerked it off with his hands. It fell on the floor. And I don't know why, but he takes detergent and sprinkles it and then falls down in it. So Denise was a stabilizing influence in more than one way. Another reason for generosity of Vladimir, for which I feel thankful, he brought me back to my own history in a small town, northwest Georgia. We lived in nature. A cousin of mine, my same age, Phil, we would hike all over, and we spent many nights in the summer in a tent, and I would wake up, with dew, flat on the ground, and Snuffy, the little dog, would have his head right up against mine. But paying attention to, trees and kicking up arrowheads in recently plowed land, somehow Vladimir taking me to Talbot County for deer hunting. We would spend the night in a little hut and then be up in a tree in the dark. And I would hear the rustling of squirrels and birds and begin to see the light like gold coins, I mean, witnessing that was more important for me than killing a deer. Guns, of course, Vladimir knew all about, and I knew I'd been hunting with my father, hunting quail, but I would never have gone deer hunting except for Vladimir. He brought me back to my own history in terms of the military. An uncle who died in World War I long before I was born, Uncle Joe, was given the honor of being, the name for the American Legion Post was named for my uncle. So Armistice Day, November the 11th, all of my people, father, uncles, were in charge of the program. And the ladies would hand out little red crepe paper poppies, and always Johnny would dress up in his uniform and taps. I mean, it was a very solemn, impressive ceremony. But the military, I had a cousin at West Point I would visit when Ruth and I were courting, we even went down the trail to the rock where you're supposed to kiss, but I told my cousin we didn't need to have the rock. KA fraternity. We were graciously called the Knights of Alcohol, and we lived up to that experience. I got rid of this kind of binge when I was a student at Mercer, but Vladimir immediately liked that organization. We made him an honorary member, and there was a saying, we had all sorts of sayings, but this one Vladimir particularly liked. How many Yankees? 10,000. How many rebels? 3. What do we do? Charge! Stories that were off color, dark stories of the Old South, Vladimir often would write down in a notebook. And 3 of the stories in the 10 that he wrote, called American Stories, had to do with stories I told him. One, Reverend Hope at one of the black churches, I don't think you can say black, Afro-American churches, had his car stolen. And it was very important for him to get the word out that he had a cobra in the back of the car. This is a true story. It was in the newspaper. But here, this man who had lost his car was trying to protect the thief from the... Well, that's one of the stories, except Vladimir calls it a python. Another was the Poor Albert letter. An insurance man, Mr. West, greatly beloved, had an alcohol problem, and so there was a sort of a Stammtisch at the Biltmore eating place, cafe, right in the center of town, and they decided to play this joke to help the alcohol problem of Mr. West. And the druggist knew somebody in New Orleans, so they composed a letter that came to Mr. West, and it says, "Dear Mr. Cone, you don't know me, but your name has been recommended as a replacement for one of my companions, poor Albert, who died 2 weeks ago. I have been an alcoholic, but I got over it, and I make speeches all over Louisiana. And Albert was the reason I had such success. He would just sit in a comfortable chair and look out the window. His mind was gone. His cells were eaten up with alcohol. And your name has been given me as a recommendation to take Albert's place. It says the money, the money won't be as big, but all you do is just sit and look out the window." Well, the insurance man who was the associate was into the joke and watched, and he said, Mr. West read this letter, and all of us said, "That son of a bitch, that son of a..." Somebody, he knew somebody who was working on him. Well, that's a second story that appears. Another story, we went to a Jewish wedding, student at Mercer in Miami, and we went with some very evangelical religious people, great on prayer. And when we got back, Carol told Ruth, said I'd forgotten to pray for my children, and we had left Susan, age 13, with a member of their little group. And at any rate, it so happened that that night, here was a pistol put against her head, and the man said, "Don't say anything, don't utter a cry, and you won't be hurt." She immediately said, "I rebuke you, Satan, in the name of my Lord Jesus Christ. I rebuke you, Satan." Well, at that time, a light was turned on by one of the members of their little group who started speaking in tongues. The man jumped out the window. My son said, "My sympathies began to shift at that particular time." Well, that's one of the stories that Vladimir picked up and told. My wife told me to skip this next one, but learning how to sip scotch. I grew up in a home that had no alcohol, but in one of the early meetings, he comes out with scotch and says, "How much?" And I knew that if I was going to have conversation with this man, I already knew there was something great and original about him. And so I began to sip scotch. And I think that makes me even more of a close cousin to what Maurice had to say. Helping me to understand Pierre Gripperie was a writer in Paris. Maurice knows him. And the term that was used by the Volkovs was member of the club, which meant he was gay. I think Gripperie earlier had been a communist, but then he had turned and was very much right-winger. But Vladimir said, we had an understanding that, that side didn't interest me, but they were very good friends, and Gripperie presented an article, I think, for the Dossier H. At any rate, my understanding of Gripperie and others was very much helped by Vladimir. It seems strange, my mother was a stickler for, eating with the fork in the right hand, which the Germans don't do, and all of a sudden with 3 forks and 3 glasses, Vladimir was a stickler. We were in Atlanta one time, and we went to about 10 places to try to choose a restaurant. We ended up in a hotel with white tablecloths and a very expensive meal. But eating, I began to find out the French really did know something about cuisine. When they had a celebration on the founder of Russia, Vladimir wrote an article how the Russians had influenced French cuisine, which I think was, to me, was very funny. Sitting up in a tree before the sun gets up, I've already mentioned, and that completes my list. I told Denise in this letter that I could go on for 50 more times, but I'll stop for that. I want to end in connection with the title of this colloquium, The Exile is My Country. In a way, that I never liked Vladimir's talk that way. I said, Vladimir, you an honorary Southerner, you're a KA honorary, you're French, you're Russian. I said, you're a man of the world. And of course, I emphasized the worldly man that he was. He went to Helsinki to sign books, and he learned enough Finnish, to speak. He was a whiz at languages. At any rate, his use of the French language, not just the French, he taught Shakespeare, he knew more. I one time was stumbling over compound verbs in English, just like a reflex. He tells me what's straight. And he wrote on French metrics. And the vocabulary, I told him James Joyce had the reputation of so many words, 25,000 more words than the usual novelist. I said, what about you? Well, they say the same thing about me. And I noticed even in the English translation, the words, I'm still learning French bilingually from Vladimir and John Dunaway. But French, you can't deny that he was born in Paris and that the French language meant a great deal to him very early, and he was already making number ones all the way through the Sorbonne. But he puts at the end of a book which he wrote, Victor de Loop is the author, and he inscribes it so Ruth and I can learn a little French. But it's a wonderful statement by Julian Green that Vladimir ends his book with, and it's in English. Quote, when I was a child, owing to my misapprehension of a picture in a history book, I got it into my head that France was a real person, a woman with a crown which she doffed at certain times to wear a Phrygian cap, and one of my main sources of worry was that sooner or later this person with whom I was in love would grow old and eventually die. Hence the strange questions I used to ask my mother. How old is France? Is she 20 or 30? Do you think she will live a long time? So deeply embedded in my mind was this idea that even as a full-grown man, I could never quite get rid of it. Neither did I really want to get rid of it, because it seemed to me that somehow it contained more truth, more hidden truth, than I was able to realize as a child. What is going to happen to her, we cannot tell. We know that she will not die because a spirit does not die, and she is essentially a spirit. But her physical life is threatened, and her physical life is as precious to many of us as the life of a mother. We need her presence. Her place cannot be filled by other nations. It is impossible that she will disappear, but if she did, a great many reasons for being attached to this life would disappear with her. She has given us more than we know. She has made the world richer and more beautiful for millions of men and women. If she ever went, we might not cease to live, but we should be poorer, and something in us would die. Thank you.